In October of 1908, an unimaginable tragedy happened here in northern Michigan. A wildfire that not only burned almost 2.5 million acres, but killed dozens as it swept across this part of Michigan. The story turns horrific when a train car loaded with refugees attempts a mad dash to the town of Posen, 5 miles from here. They thought they were outrunning the fire, but wildfires don't sweep in a straight line. It is one of the most dramatic Great Lakes disaster stories I've come across in a long time.
We're at the Metz Fire Trailside Historic Park in Presque County, northern Michigan, to learn about the Metz Fire.
I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
The channel's Restless Viking. It all started here in Millersburg, Michigan, just a few years after it was established. It seems that it was a wet spring that year, and the vegetation grew up pretty lush. But then throughout the summer there was a drought and into the fall. And the area really was a perfect tinderbox. On October 15th, 1908, it may have been a crew cutting brush, or it may have been a locomotive. They don't know for sure. But for sure, a fire started, and it was a windy day. And the fire burned north from Millersburg across the 31-mile trek of destruction.
So until it reached here, Hammond Bay on Lake Huron, it looked like the fire was dying down and ending, but then the wind picked up and it turned around and headed south again toward Metz, where 600 people lived.
Here at Metz, there were 3 general stores, 3 hotels, 3 saloons, a boarding house, shingle mill, livery stables, blacksmith shop, post office, a train station over there, and a sawmill that stood here. And this was the Mackinac and Detroit rail line. As the fire approached Metz, a relief train was summoned and arrived at about 2:30 p.m. By this time, a church and some other buildings had caught on fire. Believe it or not, residents started loading household goods and furniture on the train. Finally, as darkness started falling, a rail station employee, George Cicero, helped his wife Lizzie and his children, Margaret 7, George Jr. 5, and Gerlin 2, onto the train. Confident that his wife and young family were safe, George stayed behind to see what he could do, if anything, to save the railroad station. And then the train left and went toward Posen. And George, for his part, stayed, sending messages by telegraph to stations and hoped somehow he could keep the fire at bay. When the depot caught on fire, he sent his last message: "I can send no more, this building is all afire." And then he ran through the woods to the next town. But his young family didn't fare so well. So the relief train left Metz, Michigan, and it picked up steam as it came down that slight incline. It came up and it started to approach that bend. So as the train rounded this bend and emerged from the wooded area into a siding called Norwicki Siding, they said that it resembled a volcano, and some of the eyewitnesses said we came to hell. On one side of the tracks were carloads of hemlock bark on fire. On the other side of the track were piles of cedar posts on fire. In the middle was a railroad track whose ties had burned and whose rails had heated up, probably to red hot. And when the weight of the engine hit those tracks where the ties had been burned and heated, the engine dug into the ground and came to a stop. There were 30 to 40 people loaded in the gondola car, kind of like an open boxcar. And among those were 3 mothers and 9 children, including Lizzie, the wife of George Cicero, and their 3 young children. So the gondola was in between the burning posts and the burning bark. The wooden cars that were a part of the train caught on fire. The furniture inside the steel gondola caught on fire. And many of the people in the gondola threw children outside and jumped outside. And they tried to escape to open fields by crawling or running. They were badly burned, most of them. But still inside the red-hot gondola car were 3 mothers and their 9 children. The engineer of the train, a man named Forrester, and the fireman, Art Lee, both crawled into the locomotive's water tank. And they both stood in the water tank, shoulder deep, throwing water on each other, trying to escape the smoke and the heat. Then the coal car behind them caught on fire. Forrester escaped the tank and crawled along the ditch to the safety of an open field, but Art Lee stayed in the water tank, and his remains were found later. He was boiled to death. I guess the 3 mothers, each with 3 children, didn't think they had a chance to escape. So they stayed in the steel gondola car, and it became their crematorium. And the next day, when the car was discovered after the fire had swept through, they found small piles of ashes.
The church was burned in the fire, and a few days later, their pastor, Ernest Thiem, wrote, "Sunday, I buried at one funeral service 10 members of our church family who died in the fire. It was a strange worship service, which I conducted with a loudly sobbing congregation alongside my church in ashes, conducted over open graves. I never experienced such despair in my whole life. At first, I could not begin. I leaned against a lonely standing fence post and wept, perhaps for the first time since I was a child."
And for those that survived, they spent the first few days staying in the open in the towns that they had escaped to. Winter was a few weeks away, and the first ice that year was spotted on October 31st. The news of the horror spread around the cities in southern Michigan, and soon the D&M Railroad was bringing donated relief supplies into the area, and the construction crews began building 16 by 20 relief shacks just like this one to house those that survived the fire. And they built 165 of these shacks. One of the first communities in the state to send supplies was Grosse Pointe, which is a wealthy suburb of Detroit. And they sent some pretty nice swag. There are several pictures of survivors of the Metz Fire dressed in high-style evening wear that had been donated by the wealthy ladies of Grosse Pointe. Probably the finest clothing that they'd ever worn. Well, the female survivors at least. I looked hard for pictures of men in ladies' evening wear, but there was no dice. I'm always amazed at the amount of drama that humans have endured. We've come to understand that the Great Lakes had more than its share of tragedy and triumph. We will still have horrors and heroics. I don't think that that will ever end. It's comforting to know that we all carry on anyway. I hope we can all appreciate the perspective that these travels bring to you. It truly is an amazing world. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
Poppins, did you know that a lot of people that watch this don't actually subscribe to the channel or haven't subscribed yet?
Kidding.
Do you feel personally attacked by this? Y'all go ahead and give us a like and sub so Poppins and I can feel better about ourselves. The channel's Restless Viking. Thanks for joining us on our adventure. See you soon.
Thanks.